Here's Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. And this is Brigadier General Janice Karpinski. She was supposed to be in charge of that unit. She never visited it. That's one of the reasons some of those abuses occurred. And they want to know who are the bad apples, who's responsible for those abuses. The problem is if you frame the question of who is responsible, there's only one answer, it's people. I want to frame the question a different way. Can we raise the sound? If you ask the question, what is to blame, it could be people, but it could be something more. And obviously, the something more is what I'm going to present as a social psychologist is what is to blame, we're going to see, is the situation that corrupted those young men and women, military policemen. So how do psychologists go about trying to understand the psychological dynamics of such transformations of human character? Well, if they were always bad, it's not a transformation. They were bad and they did bad. I'm arguing, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that they start off as good, and suddenly, in a short time, they're doing these kinds of things, and worse. The traditional way that psychologists explain any human behavior, that most psychologists, all psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, people in assessment, cognitive psychologists, is the same as in religion, is the same as in medicine. We look for pathologies in the person, within the person, with defective character structure, sadistic personalities, the bad apples. Social psychologists and other social scientists say, of course, individuals are always the actors, but we have to understand the stage. We have to understand the behavioral context. We have to understand who's the stage director. We have to understand whether the behavior is alone or in an ensemble, whether it's improvised or scripted. So here it says maybe there were good men and women corrupted by the behavioral context, and we're going to talk about what that really means, by powerful situational forces, and that's where the bad barrel comes in. One of the things I did in going through these investigative reports is I moved beyond, my focus was always just on the situation. I began to ask the question about what is the system that creates those situations. And the system is the legal, historical, cultural, economic forces that maintain such situations. And this is where the real power is. So here's the power. The power creates those, and then this is a secondary power that can corrupt good people. So the Lucifer effect involves understanding human character transformation when ordinary good people become perpetrators of evil. And it's through the interplay of these three forces, things that people bring into the situation, things that the situation brings out of people, how they interact, the person in the situation, and in fact, then we have to understand those in dominant systems that create and maintain those situations. Here's a wonderful cartoon, a recent New Yorker cartoon. I'm neither a good cop nor a bad cop, Jerome. Like yourself, I'm a complex amalgam of positive and negative personality traits that emerge or not, depending on circumstances. So this is really what my talk is going to be all about. This is the amount of shock. This is the first 10 trials and the second 10 trials. If you are individuated, you start at a low level and you stay there. But we're interested in what is the effects of anonymity. In the de-individuated condition, you start at twice as high, and over time you shock more and more and more. We've done this study with masks. We've done this study throwing styrofoam balls rather than shock. And you always get the same effect. Anything that makes you anonymous in a situation that gives you permission to be aggressive, to be violent, will enhance that tendency. And the second thing is, once you get into shocking, once you get into hurting other people, it becomes self-reinforcing. And it increases more and more over time. It's kind of like a shark feeding frenzy. Does it make a significant difference? Again, we're going to go in the real world. If warriors change their appearance before going to battle, again, who cares about college students in hoods shocking other college students? Anthropologists ask this question. Does it make a difference in how they treat their victims if they change their appearance before going to battle or not? Well, we know in many cases they don't. You just go to war. You don't change your appearance. But in other cases, you do as in the Lord of the Flies. You paint yourself. You put on masks. And in most civilized nations, we put men in military uniforms. It has the same exact effect. So what's the difference? If you don't change your appearance, well, I should say there are 23 different cultures that he found. 2 bits of data. Do they change their appearance or not. There are 8 that don't change, 15 that change. And the measure he's looking at, do they kill, torture, mutilate their victims? Not pressing a button on a shock generator. 13 societies are high on killing, torture, mutilating, 10 are low. So if they don't change their appearance, only 1 of 8 cultures do this. We're interested, obviously, in the red zone. If they change their appearance, look at this. 90%, 12 of 13 societies that change their appearance are high on torturing, killing, and mutilating. So in fact, that little study in NYU has dramatic parallels in the real world. So it's culture. Culture has wisdom. It says if you want young men to kill other young men in war, put it back up. If old men want to send young men to kill other young men in war, that's what all war is about. The only thing that's different is whether it's for turf or for oil or things like this. Then you put them in a uniform. You change their appearance, and it makes it easier for them to do it. Uniform also makes them all behave the same. You take away individuality. But now when the war is over, whether you win or lose, you know what? You have to give the uniform back. Because we don't want you to come home and be a killer. We want you to go back to being a good little boy. This leads us to the Stanford Prison Experiment, which I did back in 1971. The extent to which George Tenet, former head of the CIA, Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and George Bush are responsible for command complicity in the abuses we are talking about. Again, what are the real world parallels? Compare this with this. Only paper bags are, we're ecologically minded in America, so we substitute those with sandbags. So now we don't use paper anymore. We have prisons in black sandbags chain. This is Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. So of course, I'm going to see parallels. But James Schlesinger, who was a former Secretary of Defense, he headed one of these investigative reports. And let me just take a minute to say what the parallels that he sees. The potential for abusive treatment of detainees during the global war on terrorism was entirely predictable based on a fundamental understanding of the principles of social psychology, coupled with an awareness of numerous known environmental risk factors. Findings from the field of social psychology suggest that the conditions of war, the dynamics of detainee operations carry inherent risk for human mistreatment, and therefore must be approached with great caution and careful planning and training. No training, no caution, no careful planning. Psychologists have attempted to understand how and why individuals and groups who usually act humanely can sometimes act otherwise in certain circumstances. That's my Lucifer effect. He hadn't read it because I hadn't written it yet. But he did read, the landmark Stanford study provides a cautionary tale for all military detention operations. This is 35 years old. I mean, who doesn't know the basics of that study? In contrasting the relatively benign environment of the Stanford Prison Experiment, the report makes evident, quote, that in military detention operations, soldiers work under stressful combat conditions that are far from benign. So here's this guy I defended, Chip Frederick. It was his idea to put this guy, putting him on a stress position was a Donald Rumsfeld idea, but to put electrodes on his hand and make him think that when his legs gave way, he'd fall off and he'd be electrocuted. So he did some bad things. He admitted to them. There's no question about it. You're in the pictures. What was he like before going down to that dungeon? The most all-American patriotic soldier imaginable. He's a poster boy for the military. He loves the American flag. He loves the Star-Spangled Banner. He won 9 medals and awards before going down to that dungeon. When he was in Kuwait, the kids loved him. There are pictures of him playing with the kids. He's trying to learn Arabic, even though he has very limited educational level. A model soldier in every way. So dispositional, very quickly. I have him tested by the Army psychiatrist. Normal on every dimension, no sadistic tendencies. He comes from a small town in Pennsylvania. I said won 9 medals and awards. He had been a good guard in a low security prison. He was a super patriot. What's the situational? Everything we saw in the Stanford Prison Study is there. The dehumanization, de-individuation, moral disengagement. Worst abuses happen in both places on the night shift. He worked 12-hour shifts, 4 p.m. to 4 a.m., 7 days a week, with not a day off for 40 days. He gets 1 day off and works 2 more weeks. In the most chaotic conditions, the places under bombardment. Prisoners and guards are being killed all the time. Prisoners are trying to escape. Electricity goes out. Prisoners are wandering around naked. It's filthy. There's no toilets. There's porta potties that overflow, so there's shit everywhere. There's rats all over. And he's in charge now of 1,000 prisoners, 12 Army reservists, 60 Iraqi police who are smuggling weapons in. And he has no training and no supervision. Not once in 3 months did any senior officer come down to that dungeon. And as I said, extreme fear. Why did it happen in this one place? This was the place where the CIA and military intelligence did their interrogation of high-value detainees, of people they thought were connected to Al-Qaeda. And then what happened is when the insurgency started, that our military and our military command had not a clue about, they started arresting whole families, men and women. There were children here as well. And they didn't have any information to give. So the CIA and the military intelligence and civilian interrogators put pressure on these military police, Army reservists. They're not real soldiers, they're weekend soldiers. To soften them up, to take the gloves off, to prepare them for interrogation. So they give them the permission to do whatever they wanted to do to soften them up. They just went a little too far, and they took the trophy photos. So who's responsible for creating and maintaining these conditions? Using dogs to induce fear, nakedness of prisoners, extreme stress and fear imposed, sleep, food, sensory deprivation, concealing illegal practice from Red Cross. There were 21 murders in military prisons in Iraq, Cuba, and Afghanistan. Not Chip Frederick or any of those MPs on the night shift. All of these were standard operating procedures that are outlined in my book that came directly from Donald Rumsfeld in a memo of acceptable techniques of interrogation. He brought those to Guantanamo Bay. General Miller put them in practice. General Miller took them to Abu Ghraib and told General Sanchez he had to do it. One of the reports is by a General Fay. He says, the system is guilty. For a period of 7 months, military intelligence personnel allegedly requested, encouraged, condoned, or solicited military police personnel, or they participate in detainee abuse themselves, or they established procedures, they violate established procedures. The abuses would not have occurred had military doctrine been followed and mission training conducted. It was the environment created at Abu Ghraib that contributed to occurrence of such abuse, and the fact that it remained undiscovered by higher authorities for a long period of time. Who was watching the story? It was not one day. It was months and months that these things went on. General Fay and General Jones get together on their report. They said there are 7 factors leading to this abuse. Only one was dispositional, the character structure of these soldiers. 6 are situational or systemic. They say, looking beyond personal responsibility, leader responsibility, command responsibility, systemic problems and issues also contributed to the volatile environment in which abuse occurred. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was himself a prisoner in Gulag's, in Stalin's Gulag archipelago, says, the line between good and evil cuts through the center of every human heart.
With the idea that humans are irrational in what motivates them, and they're often not even aware of what drives them to act because of their subconscious mind. So then there is this guy, Edward Bernays, and he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he used all of Freud's ideas to manipulate the masses into doing things they wouldn't have ordinarily done.
One day, Mr. George Hill, president of the American Tobacco Company, called me in and said, we're losing half of our market. And I said, why, Mr. Hill? He said, there's a taboo by men that does not permit women to smoke. So I called up Dr. Brill, who was one of the great disciples of my uncle Sigmund Freud, and asked him what cigarettes meant to women, and he answered very quickly, cigarettes are torches of freedom to women. They want to smoke to dramatize man's taboo against women by not permitting them to smoke, and that's why they want to smoke. So I called up a debutante friend of mine, asked her to get another friend and 2 young men whom they liked, and to walk from 34th Street to 57th and back and forth, lighting torches of freedom to protest man's inhumanity to women by a taboo against smoking. Next morning, there wasn't a newspaper in the United States, even the New York Times had a front page story, "Debutantes light torches of freedom to protest man's inhumanity to women by a taboo against smoking."
So how does this work in the mass media? Well, the first time these ideas made their way into the mass media was during World War I in the United States, because everybody at that time was kind of about going to war. So they wanted to whip up some anti-German frenzy. And it was incredibly successful, and an anti-German hysteria was fostered in American intellectuals at that time. Walter Lippmann was a major player in that organization. He was a journalist, and he said this: "We can manufacture consent by means of propaganda." And by that, what he means is we can get the people to do the things that we want through propaganda. Edward "I Got Ladies to Smoke" Bernays was also heavily involved, and he said the more intelligent members of the community can drive the population into whatever they want by what he called the engineering of consent. It is the essence of democracy, he said. So from the early part of the 20th century, you had some very clever people working in some powerful and effective organizations suggesting that democracy is not about people knowing what is going on in the world and offering their vote upon it. Instead, it was about a small number of people manipulating the will of the voting class to their own ends. Edward Bernays would later, in 1954, turn a total lie into reality for political gain. So in 1954, a company called the United Fruit Company had got a little concerned about the Guatemalan president. They were concerned that this president's policies of giving land to the people was going to make their business practice particularly difficult.
Less than 3% of the landowners held more than 70% of the land. So Arbenz nationalized more than 1.5 million acres, including land owned by his own family, and turned it over to peasants.
So they employed Edward Bernays to smear the reputation of the Guatemalan president. And Bernays played into the huge fear of communism that was so apparent at that time.
The American people recognized that the one real issue, not the phony issue, was the issue of communism, corruption, all tied up with the Korean War. It means that the American people are sick way down deep inside at what's been going on.
He convinced the United Fruit Company to find a top Latin American politician to condemn the actions of Jacob Arbenz. He planted stories in the press about the growing influence of Guatemala's communists. He set up a network of intelligence agents to survey Guatemala, and he then passed these agents off as legitimate sources to journalists. Despite all of this information being false, his campaign worked. It created an atmosphere of fear in the American public's mind. And people feared, for no good reason, the Guatemalan government, which compelled a United States-led intervention. So, the democratically elected president, Arbenz, was overthrown and replaced by a dictator. The United Fruit Company got what they wanted, and it was Bernays' manipulation of people's fears which had helped them to get it. So the tools that Bernays has developed are powerful ones. They demonstrate just how malleable the masses are if carefully designed propaganda is placed in the right place at the right time. He also showed that people could be manipulated politically and not just manipulated into buying things they don't really need. His methods have been proven to be effective. This is called the manufacture of consent, where you absorb carefully designed information, much like the information presented by Edward Bernays, and then you spew out an opinion or a thought or an action which has been very carefully planned for. Bernays believes this to be the essence of democracy. So what do you think? Is this a good way to run a society?
His Secretary of War says this is the MasterCard of diplomacy against the Russians, the atomic bomb. There are many, many documents that strongly suggest, particularly the Secretary of State, James Burns, understood that the bomb was more a diplomatic tool than a military tool. The chief of staff of the U.S. Army and the combined chiefs, General Marshall, said this is not a military decision. It has nothing to do with the military. It's maybe a diplomatic, political, other kind of decision, but it's not a military decision. So, interestingly, the military, I mentioned this, I think, in our last discussion, virtually all the major American military leaders went public after the war, saying the atomic bomb was totally unnecessary. Some called it barbaric. The president's chief of staff went public. Can you imagine the chief of staff saying, and he was a good friend of the president, said, this is barbarism. I wasn't taught to kill children and women. So that's very clear.
Our education system doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like the mass media, it carries out certain functions and has social consequences for different class interests in society. In totalitarian societies, public opinion is irrelevant. The masses can be bludgeoned into obedience. But in liberal democracies, this isn't acceptable, and so managing public opinion is crucial for maintaining hierarchy. As Edward Bernays said, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. In one of my previous videos, I talked about how the economic structure of the mass media engineers public opinion. However, thought control only has an indirect effect on what people do. The mass media, although being hugely influential, have limited power in this respect. They exercise ideological control. On the other hand, the education system does what the mass media cannot do: direct behavioral control. Education is a production line. The population are divided into age groups which undergo systematic instruction. Instruction is divided into a hierarchy of different subjects, with maths and languages prioritized at the top, the humanities in the middle, and the arts at the bottom. These subjects are split into a timetable, roughly over a 7-hour day. During instruction, information will be transmitted into the heads of children by what are called teachers. After a certain amount of time, children will regurgitate the information that they have been given during a standardized test. The standard of the test will be determined in order to produce a hierarchy of students. If everyone gets a good grade, there will be no hierarchy, so that's too easy. And if everyone gets a bad grade, there will also be no hierarchy, so that's too difficult. Good grades are therefore scarce. It is impossible for everyone to receive a good grade. Children are therefore forced into competition with one another because educational attainment is, by definition, mutually exclusive. Standardized tests will increase in difficulty for different age groups. To participate in higher standardized tests, students have to meet entry requirements, most likely their success in previous tests. The grades that a student receives will affect their socioeconomic status and future prospects in a non-trivial way. The content for memorization will be selected by powerful institutions, namely the government and corporations. If we assume that these institutions will not seek to undermine their own interests, they will not give out self-subverting information. Education, therefore, at least in its current form, constitutes a filtering system, in which status and prestige are awarded to children depending on their systematic obedience to authority, and subjects are prioritized according to how compatible they are with the standardized testing model.
What is a circle? Philly Handler. A circle is a closed curve in which all endpoints on the circumference are equally distanced from the center point. Very good.
The further up the educational hierarchy you go, the more obedience and conformity you will find. The population will become accustomed to a series of authoritarian social norms because their very livelihood depends on it. This model of schooling was first implemented under Prussian military rule in the early 19th century, primarily to serve the interests of industrialists and state bureaucrats. The Prussian education system was later implemented in several other countries, including the United States. Frederick Winslow Taylor's system of scientific management, designed to discipline the labor force and increase the power of management, was later implemented in American schools. Alexander Ingalls, an advocate of the system that had developed, outlined what he thought should be the 6 basic functions of school in his book, Principles of Secondary Education. Number 1. The adjustive function. Schools ought to establish fixed habits of reaction to authority in order to create obedient children that will seamlessly fit into their future social environments without causing too much of a fuss. Number 2. The integrating function. There must be a set of values and ideals that are to be universally accepted by all of the children without question, not due to any concern for egalitarian values, but in order to create as much social conformity and homogeneity as possible. Number 3. The diagnostic function. The work of individuals must be logged mathematically, and schools ought to determine the social roles of children in the future and direct them towards the desired ends. Number 4. The differentiating function. Outside of the shared set of values and ideals, differences between students must be accentuated as much as possible, not to celebrate their individuality, but to prepare them for the economic purpose of carrying out highly specialized labor. This does not conflict with conformity and obedience, but goes hand in hand with it. Number 5. The selective function. The schools should essentially carry out social Darwinism by identifying and, quote, eliminating those individuals who are unable to meet the demands set due to their so-called native capacities, and rewarding people who can demonstrate obedience more effectively. Number 6. The propaedeutic function. The education system as a whole ought to be so constituted as to further the development of an elite class of intellectuals separate from the great majority of people, which will take care of the system in the future. You can perhaps see how the model of standardized testing for obedience in tightly divided subjects in order to create a hierarchy of students serves these functions remarkably well. It forces people into the position of manipulable tools in the machine, weeds out those people who might think too much and cause a crisis of democracy, and helps to create a generally conformist and docile labor force that will obediently bend to the will of their capitalist masters. As George Carlin said, governments and corporations don't want a well-informed population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
They want obedient workers. Obedient workers.
Johann Fichte, a proponent of the Prussian system, said that the higher classes constitute the mind of the single large whole of humanity, the lower classes constitute its limbs. The vast majority of people are not supposed to do any thinking, they're supposed to execute the demands of an elite minority. The masses must be dumbed down and told what to think. Fichte believed that education should completely destroy free will. He said that the schools must fashion the person, and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. Let's consider some other implications of our education system. Other than the minimal knowledge required to generate people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, as Carlin said, what little lessons can we expect the average child to acquire as they are being shipped along the educational production line? John Taylor Gatto listed 7. Number 1. Confusion. Throughout the school day, rather than tailoring to the needs of individuals, children will not have any control over the periods of time they spend on a given subject. This ensures that significant numbers of people will not be given adequate time to digest the information being transmitted to them at their own pace, helping to foster the creation of a bewildered herd with little to no idea of what the fuck is going on. Number 2. Indifference. The children will understand that what's called learning is about assuming the position of an empty receptacle into which unquestionable absolute truth is poured, and that this process can be turned on and off like a light switch, as well as merely being a means to achieving so-called good grades. The schools should generate indifference to anything that could remotely be described as real learning. The schools are factories for creating systemic ignorance. Number 3. Class position. Members of the working class should be well aware that the education system is not designed for them, but in fact serves the strategic and economic interests of corporate and state bureaucrats. As they are moved along the conveyor belt, the people should know their place and understand that it's there to provide an obedient workforce that can be disciplined and controlled by managers with a minimum amount of hassle. Number 4. Emotional dependency. The children should become emotionally dependent on so-called positive reinforcements, a term originally coined when training lab rats, I should note, such as a pat on the head, a smile, an A+, or any other kind of reward from above. In other words, doggy biscuit bribes to make children follow instructions. The reason for this is to train and socialize the children to embrace behaviorist methods of control. Techniques originally tested on animals to get children to stop doing what you don't want them to do and start doing what you do want them to do.
So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment.
Number 5. Intellectual dependency. Children will be socialized to believe that authority is the ultimate source of unquestionable truth. Children are to be put into an atmosphere in which questioning authority is the worst thing you can do, even if the authority makes an incorrect statement. It's not about truth, it's about obedience, and truth is only valuable insofar as it fosters obedience. Indeed, a far better test of intellectual dependency is to get children to believe anything that an authority says, even if it's totally stupid. Number 6. Provisional self-esteem. Children will be constantly beaten over the head with the idea of so-called mutual respect. This gives the impression of a mutually beneficial situation, but in reality the idea of so-called mutual respect is basically a device used to explain to the children that they will be respected not in the Kantian sense of respecting them as human beings, but only insofar as they do what is asked of them and demonstrate obedience. Respect means that children must ask for permission to go to the toilet. It means veneration of authority and degradation of the individual. Number 7. The impossibility of hiding. Children are to be made to feel utterly powerless. Every single piece of work they produce and everything they do must be subjected to constant and systematic surveillance, examination and evaluation, while so-called progress must be logged in cumulative records. The fact that they are being watched all the time should help to make the children feel as small as possible and understand that their ultimate purpose in life is to assume the position of minuscule objects, to be placed under the absolute control of people with more power and status than them. By now it should be fairly apparent that the education system has very little at all to do with learning. It's about making children internalize authoritarian social norms and behavioral patterns and understand their position in the hierarchical society.
Universities are on the verge of an apocalyptic and terminal collapse. At least that's what you'd have to believe if you went to a bookstore and looked under the education section at the titles. By my count, in the last couple of years, there have been 39 books written on the demise of the North American university. These attacks come from the political left and they come from the political right. They come from inside the academy and outside the academy. I reviewed a couple of these books a few months back for the international science magazine Nature, and I began my review as follows. Universities today are fractious places, populated by customers, formerly known as students, who pay increasingly large amounts of mostly borrowed money in exchange for high grades from researchers with large frequent flyer mile accounts, formerly known as professors, who report to real estate developers, formerly known as university presidents. Now this, of course, is a caricature, but as in most caricatures, it conveys elements of truth. One of the many problems of the modern university is that they have taken on, or perhaps had imposed on them by society, too many goals. Universities are supposed to be triggers of urban renewal and engines of economic growth. They're supposed to cure sick people. They're supposed to generate new knowledge and train the next generation of scholars and, if possible, spin off biotech companies in the process. They're supposed to provide an endless supply of talking heads for the 24/7 news cycle. Now, all of these things, with the possible exception of the talking heads, are social goods. There's nothing wrong with economic development or certainly curing sick people or generating new knowledge, but they have created a culture in which the language tells it all. You talk to any university faculty member and they will tell you about their teaching load and their research opportunities. And being mostly rational people, they attempt to minimize their loads and maximize their opportunities. Thus, we have a reward system with multiple levels of faculty, assistant professors, associate professors, full professors, chaired professors, and then in some institutions, university professors. They are at the top of the pinnacle, 0.1% of the distinguished faculty. And you know what the distinguishing feature of a university professor is? They never have to teach again. So the problem with these multiple roles and this culture is that they're inimical to the purpose for which universities were founded, and that is to educate young people. And I use educate in the sense of its Latin root, educatus, educare. It does not mean to pour bits of information from my full vessel into your empty vessels. What it means is to open up and lead forth, to open up minds to new perspectives and then lead them forth to a lifetime of learning. 4 courses in a semester, but they take them in series rather than in parallel, what we call blocks. You walk in the classroom and you have nothing else to do for the month, and the students have nothing else to do for the month. So if you want to go on a field trip, you don't have to worry about getting back in time for their chemistry lab in the afternoon, or the fact they have an English paper due the next day, because they don't. They're yours. I'm an astronomer. If I want to keep them up all night for 18 hours, not a problem, because that's all they're doing is astronomy. If you want to teach them international economic development, you could do that in a classroom in BC out of a textbook, or you could send them to Belize for 3.5 weeks and teach the course there. That's the mode we operate in. It's called the block system, and every academic I've spoken to about it says, well, I see how that would work in your field, but it won't work in my field. Everyone except the 40 tutors at Quest, none of whom will ever go back to teaching any other way because this is so extraordinarily effective. And I'll give you one example, because I only have 2 minutes left, rather than the 100 that I could. Every student at Quest in their first year has to take a math course. But the point of the math course, and all the other of the foundation courses, is not to pour knowledge from the full vessel to the empty one, not to gain a set of facts which you can find easily with Google, as my students so eloquently said, but it is to show by example how a mathematician asks questions about the world and goes about trying to answer them, and how a philosopher does that, and how a poet does that, and how a physicist does that. So they can accumulate those tools and apply them to their unique interests. So everyone takes a math class, and one of the math classes is spherical trigonometry. How many people have had spherical trigonometry? That's what I thought, because it's not taught in any university in North America except ours. And the reason it's taught there is because our math tutor, a remarkable pedagogue, loves spherical trigonometry. His book came out with Princeton University Press 2 months ago on spherical trigonometry. This was a huge development in the 19th century, because after all, we do live on a sphere. And it turns out trigonometry is different on a sphere, and so your GPS would not work at all unless it understood spherical trigonometry, and therefore you don't have to. But in the 19th century, this was important for navigation and for surveying, and so Glenn teaches spherical trigonometry, and this class becomes a cult. They get these lucite spheres so they can draw, and they carry them around like pet rots. You know, take them to the cafeteria, show their friends how to do this trigonometry. And 2 Decembers ago, a remarkable thing happened. Glenn has taught this class in 3 universities, 6 or 7 other times. He had a group of 18 first-year students in their 4th month of university. None of them were going to be math majors. We don't have math majors because we don't have departments, but nonetheless, none of them were particularly interested in math. This course has a reputation, so the kids all signed up for it. And on the 9th day of class, Glenn presented a theorem first published in 1807, reproduced in every textbook ever since, and in his forthcoming book at that time with Princeton University Press. And by the end of the 3-hour class, the students had found a logical flaw in the proof that had escaped mathematicians for 200 years, which meant Glenn had to withdraw his galley proofs, fix it, and acknowledge his class in the acknowledgments for having advanced the field of spherical trigonometry as a bunch of first-year non-math major students. That's the level of analytical ability one can cultivate. That's the level of engagement one gets in this regard. It's actually, I must confess, not a completely original idea. 2,500 years ago, Confucius summed it up succinctly as usual. Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I'll remember. Involve me and I'll understand.